The reading this morning is Acts chapter 27, verses 18 through 20. So Acts chapter 27, 18 through 20. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, then from then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned.
Well, I'm going to be talking about being on boats. And I know that some of you might have some experience with that. Maybe some of you have never been on a boat. Some of you may own one and get away once in a while, but it's not a typical part of your day to be off the land and on something that floats. It's not very often for a lot of you, if ever. You will live most of your life on land, as far as I know. So as a result, maybe there are times that you remember being on a boat or a ship, and that probably has a bigger impact on you. One of the few times I got to be on a boat, it was a big ship. It was a cruise. A lot of you have been on cruises and things like that. It's kind of like being in a giant floating mall for a week, and it's kind of fun. And but one time we were on a cruise, my family and I, and there was a storm. And, you know, a big ship doesn't feel it too much, but it was a good reminder that we were at sea. When you're on a big ship, you can almost get used to the idea that you're on land because it's so big you don't even feel it anymore. And we'd kind of gotten used to things being relatively stable. And then the storm came, and it was difficult to walk in a straight line down the halls, and then stairs were kind of an extra challenge. I remember one part there was at the top of the ship, there was a swimming pool on the ship, and the water was rushing from one side of the pool to the other as the ship tipped back and forth, and one of the workers there was trying to put a net over it so if anybody fell in, they'd be okay. And he'd try to hook up one part of the net, and then he'd have to run away while the water came, and then when it went away, he'd run and hook up another part of the net. It was pretty interesting to watch. And we were eating dinner, in fact, that evening, and we were enjoying passing stuff to each other without really doing anything. We just set the salt shaker on its side and say, pass the salt, and there it went. And the waiter, I remember that night, was telling us that we were pretty impressed with that storm. He said, oh, this is nothing. He remembered storms where the waves were hitting several stories up on the side of the ship. It made you realize how frightening it could be to be on something that could sink and to be in a situation where your life is on the line. Paul went through a lot of things. He at one point even kind of gives a brief list of things. But I don't know if you remember one time some people are after him and they lower him in a basket over the wall to try to get away from the people who are after him. And then there was just a straight out conspiracy. 40 guys said, we're not going to eat anything until we kill this guy Paul. So he'd had his share of what you might think of as adventures. But one thing I would say probably stood out in his memories in Acts 27. And it was a ship that he was on, and he was involved in a shipwreck. And I'm gonna kind of refer to different verses in Acts 27. I'll encourage you to read it on your own later. But we're gonna look at this in detail, just briefly for our own purposes this morning. He's headed to Rome, and it's gonna not go well, as there's gonna be a shipwreck. And he even knew that ahead of time. If you glance at verse 10. He says this voyage is going to be disastrous. There's going to be great loss to the ship, loss of cargo, maybe even loss of life. It's one thing for any of us to get on a ship that might sink. You can imagine what it would be like to get on a ship that is going to sink, and he knew that ahead of time. He really doesn't have any say in the matter. He's a prisoner, not a cruise ship at all. This is a transportation of prisoners. He's being transferred to Rome with a bunch of other prisoners, and God is giving him inside information. That's important to know about Paul. He's got inside information in this case, and he knows the ship is doomed. He says everyone might die. This could not go well. This might really turn out bad for everybody. So he's in the custody of a centurion, and he goes to the centurion. He's talking to the centurion, and he warns him. If you look at verse 11, he warns him. He says, this is not going to go well, but the centurion doesn't listen to Paul. And notice the centurion actually listens to a couple other guys. He listens to the pilot and the owner of the ship. So he's getting conflicting information. And the centurion, instead of listening to Paul, who has accurate information, he listens to the owner of the ship and the pilot, and they're both saying, thumbs up, we're good. Paul's warning seemed like bad information, so instead the centurion listens to the bad advice of these other two guys. Look at verse 13. There's a gentle south wind. It begins to blow. And notice it says they thought they'd obtained what they wanted. You can imagine them shaking their heads about what Paul said. This guy clearly has no access to accurate weather information. And it seems like they had a good plan. And then in verse 14, it all turns around. A wind of hurricane force. Verse 15, in fact, it's so strong they can't head into the wind at all. They finally have to give up, and they give way to the wind, and they're driven along. And this is kind of startling. If you were on a ship that did what we're about to read here in verse 17, they pass ropes underneath the boat to hold it together. So you can imagine being on a ship and watching the crew running ropes underneath the ship to just hold it together a little longer. They are not in control. They had a plan, but they're not in control anymore. And even worse, they're heading in a bad direction. It says that they feared they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis. And it's on the north coast of Africa, and it's very rocky and dangerous. Not only are they out of control, but they're headed straight for a very bad part of the world. So they're not just slightly concerned. Now they know they could actually sink, as Paul tried to warn them. And they start making some interesting choices. They start getting rid of things of value. You've probably seen enough movies, or I hope you've never been in this situation, where in order to keep the boat afloat, you start throwing things overboard, including things of value. In verse 18, they throw the cargo overboard, some things of value. And then they throw the tackle overboard. That's in verse 19. That's the equipment they need to run things. And the cargo was valuable, the equipment was valuable, but they're weighing that against their lives, which are more valuable. So we've got to lighten this ship if we're going to survive. So when it comes down to choosing, they're ready to throw away other things in order to save their life. Look at verse 20. It's just read for us. Jim read this for us. It says, there's no sun or stars for many days. That's how they told what direction they were going, where they were. Essentially no sense of direction, and the storm continued to rage. And notice it says they gave up all hope of being saved. All the factors seem to equal that this is not going to end well at all. They threw overboard the cargo and the equipment, but it made no real difference for them. And now they're ready to listen to Paul, the man with the inside information. And he has more details about the outcome. Notice in verse 21, he says, you should have listened to me. But verse 22, he says, keep up your courage. And he gives them some great news. He says, not one of you is going to be lost. Not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. So the thing that you're on that's carrying us, that's awash. It's going to be done for. This is its last voyage. But you're going to be okay. The ship is definitely going down, but everybody's going to survive. Look at verse 25. He says, keep up your courage. And in verse 26, nevertheless, we must run aground on an island. So he's giving them some specific details. You're going to survive, but it's going to be a rough ride. It's going to be a rough ride. There's going to be a shipwreck. So verse 27, for the sake of time, I'll just touch on a couple things lightly. In verse 27, they can tell that the water's getting shallower. That means they're approaching land. Verse 30, look at this. Some sailors go to the back of the boat, and they're pretending to lower some anchors, but what they're actually doing is getting the lifeboat ready. They're going to ditch everybody. So they're getting the lifeboat ready, and it makes sense. You know, if your ship's going down and you have another little ship, you use it. But Paul tells them something pretty interesting, and it had to have been a difficult choice. Verse 31, he tells them, says, unless everybody stays with the ship, you won't be saved. You can't rely on this little boat. You've got to stay with the ship until the very end. And that's got to be a real tough choice. The lifeboat seems like a good backup plan. But now their hopes have been reduced to relying on Paul's inside information, and they listen to him. And in verse 32, they do it. They cut loose the lifeboat. Verse 34, Paul says this, not a hair from the head of any of you will perish. Not one hair is going to be lost. Verse 36, so they're encouraged by Paul, and they eat. Verse 38, they throw the grain overboard. You notice it's getting more and more light, more and more desperate. So they make this other choice. They get rid of the grain. They're stripped down to almost nothing just to try to survive. And then they hit a reef in verse 41. And I don't know if you know, but reefs are very dangerous. They're like almost like razors. They can just totally annihilate a ship. And that's what happens. The ship gets stuck on the reef, and then the waves just start bashing it to pieces, and it's falling apart. Things get so desperate that the men in charge, this is in verse 42, 43, remember this is a ship of prisoners, and so the men in charge, they say, we need to kill the prisoners because if everybody gets to shore, they're going to escape. But the centurion stops them, and he's protecting Paul. He says, no, we're not going to kill the prisoners. Verse 44, they abandon the ship. They start swimming if they can, or they grab some debris of the wreckage if they can't, and everyone makes it to land safely. So I tell you all that because I think it's probably a strong memory for Paul, the time he almost died in a shipwreck, and I think we could use it this morning maybe to apply to our current situation. And I think it's recorded for a reason, not just so we read it and say, wow, that's interesting that happened to Paul. There's certain things that happen in our life that are similar to what happened to Paul during this voyage, during his wild trip to Rome. And I'm going to just take a few minutes to draw some possible analogies. I think we're just like Paul. We're on a doomed ship. It's called our body. And just like Paul, our voyage is going to be disastrous. We're on a voyage called life, and no matter what, the ship is going down. Everybody knows that. I remember being little and saying, wow, it was kind of a big realization. I don't know if you remember it very well. And the outcome is all or nothing. We either go down with the ship or we're going to survive. It's very simple. It's kind of nice to get that information to realize that you could survive the shipwreck, so to speak. I'm also going to share with you something that happened to me in Idaho. It's the closest I ever came to a shipwreck, no comparison. We went whitewater rafting. Some of you have probably done that before, and like the guys on Paul's ship, we didn't really grasp the danger until things started going wrong. And I'm going to share some of those details with you. It's kind of same with just everyday life. You don't really understand what's at risk until things start going wrong. There's long stretches of our life where everything's kind of falling together and it's bearable and things are all right. But sometimes it takes, a sudden turn. In Idaho, some friends and I were just having a good time. And we, like I say, we didn't really understand the implications of the possible dangers of rivers. As we live our lives, we tend to ignore the inside information, kind of like they did with Paul. The inside information we have is provided by the Word. And a lot of times we listen to bad advice instead of listening to what Paul had to say, who had access to God's information. We listen often to what we want to hear. You've probably heard 2 Timothy 4:3, very typical of us. 2 Timothy 4:3 says, "For the time will come when men will not put up with sound doctrine," in other words, accurate information. "Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear." If you look around long enough, you will find someone to tell you what you want to hear, not necessarily what you need to hear. In Idaho, there was a guy in charge. He was the one taking us on this trip. There were 7 of us, 6 amateurs, and then the 7th was our captain, so to speak, of the raft. And he sat in the back, and we assumed he knew what he was talking about. We're kind of like the guys on Paul's ship. We say, well, he's the captain of the ship. Certainly he knows what's going on. We just assumed that the captain or the owner would know what they're talking about. Well, on the raft, the plan was to ride the river. I'd never been on a raft. A lot of us hadn't. But it had been done many times before. It wasn't like we were going through an unexplored river. They always did this. They had a company. But no one had checked the river that day, and it had been a little high and a little cold, and there was one spot in particular that nobody had checked that day, and we were the first run. A lot of times we're making choices in life. We ignore God's word. We follow the guidelines of worldly thinking, and we believe we get what we want. Notice that? You remember that during the trip for Paul? Just like Paul and his shipmates, they followed bad advice, and it says they thought they had obtained what they wanted. And that happens in life too. Say, I'm making my choices, I'm bringing, thinking my way through this. It describes the life of almost everyone on this planet. We get what we think we want, and either we lose it or we discover that what we want is not what we hoped it would be. So in Idaho, we're laughing and enjoying the scenery. Everything's under control. In fact, we even practiced controlling the raft. The guy in charge, our captain, was sitting in the back, and he'd say, "Okay, everybody row left." And the left side would row, and then us on the right, I was on the right. And he says, "Okay, row right." And we did it. We thought we had it under control. We can do this. It looks much harder in the movies and stuff. We got this down. We'd gotten what we wanted. Everything's going according to plan. And remember when Paul was on the ship, they were driven along. Life has a tendency to move forward, and it's foolish to think that you're in control. We kind of delude ourselves, don't we, where we kind of think we've got all the numbers lined up, our schedules and our things to do. Without God, that's kind of what life will be. You'll just kind of be driven along by the force of life, a very strong current. And some will resist God so that they can choose the direction of their life. I want to be free. I don't want the restrictions of religion. But without God, you will soon lose all real choice of direction in your life. And your happiness will be a very precarious thing. It will depend on a lot of things that are out of your control. And you will be swept along. And happiness will come and go. In Idaho, we thought we were under control. We were under that illusion. But the river was in control. And we made little adjustments. But the current was moving us. That's what was in control. And without God, we know we're headed towards disaster. Paul and the people on the ship realize they're headed towards that place I told you about called Sardis. That's in verse 17. You can imagine what's going through their mind. They're headed somewhere and they can't change the outcome. And without God, that's what happens. Something similar happened to us in our raft. Everything was going fine. We came around a bend in the river. We didn't see it really up ahead until just a short distance, maybe from here to the back wall of this room. We had that much time to think. I guess they didn't tell us before we got in the raft. This area is called the Sleeping Giant. And we quickly saw our situation, and it was too late. Our captain, I think, in his mind was when we got around the corner, he would say, "Okay, veer right, veer left," but he didn't say much of anything of use to us because he knew our situation was completely out of our control. The water was higher at that time of the year than he expected, and it basically had become a bowl-shaped descent in the river. The water kind of curled back up against itself in the current, almost like a loop in the water. And I'd seen, people kind of flip over sideways in rafts. That's not what we did. The choices that we made upstream were now locked in. There was nothing we could do except meet the consequences. I think sometimes that happens in life is when we are faced with something, suddenly our priorities change. My daily Bible reading becomes more focused. I suddenly have time to pray. I know that happens to me all the time, depending on how well my day is going. And you'll find that what you thought was important wasn't, and since you'll start throwing things overboard, maybe like the cargo on Paul's ship. When you suddenly realize the true reality of your journey, your priorities change. Well, the water in Idaho was kind of curling back on itself, and like I said, I'd seen rafts flip over sideways. We flipped completely backwards. It was almost perfect, head over heels, and completely upside down. We landed upside down. Everyone was in the water, and suddenly this fun time was a matter of life and death. I remember I was wearing a hat, and I had glasses at the time, and my hat was gone. My glasses were sort of hanging on. I remember thinking, okay, I need to either grab for my glasses or I need to work on this air situation. So I chose air and floundered a little bit, and my glasses are in the Pacific Ocean, I think, right now. They were swept away along with my hat. And I remember, thinking this is a bad situation. Again, there's no comparison, but the guys on Paul's ship says they finally gave up all hope of being saved. And in this world, you begin to realize everything sinks, including the world itself. Not only is your life or your body kind of like a ship, this whole world is very sinkable. And there's only one solid place to stand, and that's God. He's our place of stability. That's when we fully appreciate that, we become more determined to make sure our relationship with Him is solid. Well, in Idaho, we're all out of the raft. We're being swept downstream. We're hanging on to this raft that was now upside down. And this, this was not in the brochure at all. Kind of frightening. I remember paddling and trying to get to shore, and not making any progress. The only direction we had was downstream. We could not get to shore. And our leader, who had now become a voice of reason, at this point I can use him in a different way for the analogy. He knew what he was talking about. He asked us to try to push him up on the raft, and the plan was for us to push him up there, and then he would be able to pull us up on top of the raft that was upside down. We couldn't. We were too low in the water. We couldn't get him up on the raft. There's everybody at one point in their life realizes that life is temporary, and you discover that you're going to have to say goodbye to your vessel. It's kind of like the men on Paul's ship that Paul's telling us, says your ship's going to be destroyed. That's just a done deal. And it's kind of rough to face that about our own lives or the world itself. But it's also encouraging to hear what follows. But you're going to be okay. You're going to be rescued. That's the inside information. That's the message of hope. I started feeling a little bit of hope when we were in the water. We knew that our leader maybe had made a mistake. We probably realized that more later. Right now, we just knew that he knew how to handle the situation. And I remember when I heard that our leader was still with us, some of us, there were two rafts actually, some people were in different situations, but most of us were with the leader at the raft. And I felt like there was a plan, because he kind of talked us through maybe getting on top of the raft, and that wasn't working. And we had lost the raft. We had to make it to shore, and we had a chance. And I remember, since there was somebody there who was in charge, we'd be all right maybe. And when you realize the reality of your voyage, when things get rough, you find out that suddenly you're more interested in what God has to say. I don't know if we paid that much attention to our captain of the raft until we were in the water, but I can tell you one thing. When we were in the water, we were very focused. Tell us what to do. And God, with the Word being His voice, that can get us through this. We might be tempted to look for other solutions or other insight, but the wise choice, of course, is to trust God. And sometimes that will require you to let go of things that you thought were options, like those men who cut the ropes that held the lifeboat. Sometimes it will require you to sacrifice cargo or equipment or grain, or maybe even the very thing that you think is going to make your life okay. That was a real act of faith in Paul's guidance to cut that lifeboat loose. It helped them to focus on the one and only hope that was real. And our sacrifices are kind of like that. It might be a matter of giving up the things that, provide money and maybe our jobs, and it helps us to focus on the things that really matter. It teaches us to rely on God. So the guy in charge of this upside-down raft told us to do something, and I remember very clearly thinking, I don't like this plan, and now I understand, but at the time I thought it was a bad plan. He said, okay, since we couldn't get him up on top of the raft, he says you need to let go of the raft. Now all of us were clinging to this upside down raft going down the stream, but I remember very clearly him saying, let go of the raft. And I remember thinking very clearly, I don't want to let go of the raft. This is, we had life jackets on, but this is the biggest floating thing in sight, and the shore is not getting any closer. But I very clearly remember thinking, okay, he probably knows what he's doing. He didn't have time. It's very loud. There's water in your face. All I heard was him telling us to let go, and so I did. And I remember making that decision very clearly. It was a conscious effort because I figured he knew what he was doing. Since you realize that your life is temporary, there's great peace of mind if you fully believe that there's a plan for your safety. It's not a pie-in-the-sky desperate maneuver. There is somebody who's got a great plan. Like in Paul's situation, despite the shipwreck, they're going to survive. And we're promised a place. We need to really believe this. Jesus told me, John 14:1, it says, do not let your heart be troubled. Don't be scared. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. For I go to prepare a place for you. It says there's going to be a good outcome to all this. Jesus set up a safe place called the church, those who belong to him, and that keeps us safe until we arrive at the ultimate safe place of heaven. I'm glad to tell you in Idaho, everybody survived. There were one girl was swept downstream, and she kind of enjoyed it. She just kind of went downstream and enjoyed the ride. One guy was unconscious when they got him out of the water, but he survived as well. It was a pretty close call. But we all made it safely, just like Paul and his men did. We listened to the guide, and we let go of the raft and kept paddling. I want to mention this. At first, I remember it was as we got separated from the raft, it was me and one other guy, and we kept paddling, trying to get to the shore. You had to kind of paddle sideways. And for a while, it didn't seem like we were making any progress. I remember reaching for branches and anything that was sticking out of the shore, and it just passing by. But we kept at it. And we kept at it, and finally we were able to crawl exhausted to safety. I guess I want to mention that in passing, too, because sometimes it may feel like you're not making any progress, but you know there's a plan of safety. But the raft was gone, but we made it. So this is what I want to say in closing. I'm sharing about this boat thing. It might help this morning to gain a little clarity as you set out this week and continue to live our lives. To realize our life is a lot like Paul's trip to Rome. Every day is a matter of spiritual survival, and it's going to be a rough ride. I wish I could tell you that it's going to be easy, and there will be some nice times. There will be some good laughs for you. If you're without God, they'll be brief. If you're with God, there will be other troubles for you. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you it's all going to be easy either. But you'll have an umbrella for the storm, I guess you could think of it that way. But no matter what, this ship is going down. Either the big one called Earth or each of us as individuals. There's a limited amount of time, and it's important to realize that you're not in control. It's important to not listen to bad advice. It's important to let God guide the ship. Sometimes it will be important to throw things overboard, the things that weigh you down, but with the realization that this physical life is limited and eventually it ends. It is incredibly comforting to me, and I hope so to you, to know that God has a plan. And in this plan, you will reach shore safely. You're going to be fine. So I encourage you this morning to make the decision to get rid of the things that might be making your voyage difficult. Make sure Jesus is determining your direction. Be baptized into his blood and become part of the plan. That is the plan. And this is a good plan. Because if you listen to God's advice, you will survive. He will make sure that all of us get home safely. Pray you'll think about it while we stand together and sing.